This video will cover the Jain worldview. So we're still embedded within ancient Indian culture, and Jainism, like Buddhism, is going to be a direct result of disagreements within the Hindu worldview, or at least the Hindu tenets. So we'll find that both Jainism and Buddhism are direct offshoots of Hinduism, and Hinduism, like it has done in its entire history, usually tries to absorb these religions. So although Jainism is not a religion that we would identify as having a large quantitative number, especially with regard to the world, there are principles and tenets within Jainism that are very much still alive today and worth discussing and talking about. So we'll talk about the worldview here. So we're going to cover those 7 elements that we've talked about thus far. So just to give a little background on Jainism, I've already typed up some notes and posted those, and I'll post a few others just to give you some more history and background on it. Perhaps that the book does not provide, or at least a little more insight that can be added to the content that we already have. Okay, so in terms of its origination, Jainism is a 6th century faith, or at least it has its orientation or roots within. So unlike Hinduism, Jainism does have a founder. His Jina name would be Mahavira, but his name prior to that would be Nataputta Vardhama. So that's Nataputta as in Nancy A. Much like the Buddha is Siddhartha, that is not his given name, right? His given Indian name. So once these individuals have, I guess what we might call transformed themselves in some way, right? Been enlightened, they get these names. Okay, so Jainism itself is a response primarily to the Vedic sacrificial system. So if we again refer back to Hinduism, back to about 3000 to 2500 BCE, there, the start of the Vedic religion would be the orientation of Hinduism. And they obviously had a system of sacrifice, right? Sacrificing animals. And that did not sit well with neither Buddhists, I should say, nor Jains. So the control of the caste system by the Brahmins, as well as the sacrificial system, led to what we'd call the reform attempts, or at least the reform aspects of both Jainism and Buddhism. And like I said, Jainism is a relatively small religion today. You might be able to find about 8 to 10 million Jains in the world. So they do outnumber even, I would think, those who are practicing Judaism. Probably not by a lot, but certainly by some number. One would think that there would be close to as many Jains, if not more. And most of those Jains are centered around Mumbai in India, but they have immigrated to other countries, just not as there isn't as much spreading or diaspora within the Jain faith, so they've been closed off for quite some time. Despite its size, though, the impact of Jainism on other religions and philosophy has been significant, as I said, especially with the sort of modern sense of pacifism, and obviously one of the main tenets of Jainism is ahimsa, so that has a specific influence on the history of the world and where we are today. Jainism comes from the Sanskrit term jina, which we'll talk about as an end or goal to achieve, and that term just means conqueror. So it's the honorary title given to the great teachers. And let's see, lastly, we might be able to say, before we get into the delineation here of the 7 aspects, those who seek to follow the example of these figures, they are called Tirthankaras. There are 24 of them. at least in the history of Jainism. So we'll talk about those. Another aspect of distinction between, say, Hinduism and both Jainism and Buddhism is the participation of women. So women are obviously domesticated, to say the least, in Hinduism, right? Their only duties or obligations have to do with child rearing and domesticated life. So in Jainism, in both Jainism and Buddhism, women are allowed to participate in the faith, not just in terms of duties prescribed to them, but they can actually participate in being nuns, just like the males can be monks in both Jainism and Buddhism. So patriarchy alive and well in all the Western faiths. You don't see that in the Western faiths really at all until probably the 21st century, 20th and 21st century, where you'll have some splinters of, say, Christianity that allow women in their hierarchy, but very, very rarely, and certainly not in Catholicism. So that's the largest aspect of Christianity in the world. Okay, so essentially we're going to be talking about how we escape the nature of karma. So karma is obviously going to be an element that is significant to Jains as well as Hindus, but there's going to be a slight sort of difference between how Hindus view the nature of karmic activity, as well as how Jains view that same aspect of karma, since they both agree that karma is one of the central problems. Okay, so let's look at how they view humanity. So the spiritual soul is how they would identify humanity. So the notice how the term jiva here is not the same, or at least not interpreted the same as jiva in the Hindu perspective. So remember, jiva in the Hindu perspective meant sort of ego personality, right? That was the self that was not enduring, but the self that was present in terms of attaining pleasures, right? Identifying with attachments in the material world. So that is different from the Jain perspective. So although the Sanskrit for jina is life principle, right? The life principle in terms of a person's material nature. So in that way, it's very similar, but it's different in terms of how they identify what the spiritual soul is. So the spiritual soul, or at least according to Jain belief, is that these souls are eternal and infinite. So you could probably say the jiva is akin to the Atman of Hinduism, but the jiva in Hinduism is not akin to the jiva of Jainism, right? So they do use the same term, but it means something different for both Hindus and Jains. So they would argue, or at least state, that these souls are by nature perfect, blissful, all-knowing, eternal, and like most things that are eternal, they're infinite in number, right? They don't have specificity or place, location. So the next aspect, so we got that distinction. So all humans are seen in this fashion. We do not have Atmans, so to speak. Right? We just have a spiritual soul, or a jiva. All right, so what is the problem that Jains are recognizing? What is the human condition or the human problem? Much like Hinduism, souls are weighed down by actions, right? That is the nature of karma. And this is a significant difference between Hindus and Jains. Karma is a form of subtle matter. So you see the term ajiva, right? So jiva is the spiritual soul. Ajiva is subtle matter, or forms of matter. So much like when we talked about knowledge and ignorance, so vidya would be knowledge, and then you see the A in front of it, avidya, that becomes ignorance, right? Away from it. So spiritual soul jiva, you put the A in front of it, it moves away from spirituality towards matter, right? Towards its opposite. Okay, so like Hinduism, the fundamental problem Jainism recognizes is that these spiritual souls are confined by karma to the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. So they're still confined by karma to samsara, so you still have those same elements. However, for Jains, karma is not just a law, right? Karma is a form of subtle matter. So through activity, essentially we build up this subtle matter, and this is what prevents us from attaining liberation. So much like what Hindus suggest, especially with regard to actions that are not that do not come from, say, good intentions, or they are not part of the nature of our dharma. That's what prevents us. Here, all activity creates this subtle matter or ajiva, and this ajiva buildup is what prevents us from essentially attaining that liberation that is both present in Hinduism and Jainism. So, because this karma is a form of very subtle matter, the human dilemma is that when we act, karmic matter attaches and weighs down the jiva. And insofar as it does that, the more karma that a soul accumulates in any given existence, the lower down the ladder of existence the soul will be born, right? So that process of samsara, the more we act in the world according to Jains, the more likely our rebirth will be of a lower status. So we could say this, being born, say, as a human in the here and now, indicates that the jiva has worked its way a long way up the scale, since humans are pretty high on the hierarchy of being. Let's see. And since we're high up on that scale and we have a unique opportunity to rid ourselves of the existing karma, and obviously we can stop the accumulation of more if we limit our activity, and we'll get into the cause and end and means to clarify this a bit more. Let's see, what else can I add here? There are so from some of the Jain scriptures, so let me just read this. So this says that the universe is peopled by manifold creatures who are in this samsara, right? So all life is part of samsara, not just life in the sort of earth and universe existence, but all spirits. So even gods, according to James, would be subject to what we might call, samsara is not the correct term for them, but they would be caught in the same sort of cycle in which they would have to be required to be liberated in some way. All right, so let me finish reading this. So the universe is peopled by manifold creatures who are in this samsara born in different families and castes for having done various actions. Sometimes they go to the world of gods, sometimes to the hells, sometimes they become demons in accordance with their actions. Sometimes they become nobles, warriors, servants, or outcasts, right? So that's the caste system there. But by the cessation of karma, perchance living beings will reach in due time a pure state and be born as men. All right, so I might say one of the more interesting implications of the Jain view of our human problem is that there's this view of knowledge called anekantavada, right? So that term in English, or at least from the translation, would be like multiplism or myriad perspective. So the idea is that because because this spiritual soul is weighed down by this subtle matter, we can in no way see in a comprehensive manner. We are limited in our perspective. So not unlike any sort of philosophy that might entertain the idea of a sort of relativistic view, right? We're confined to our subjectivity, and because of that, we can only see from certain perspectives, right? We could never actually see in the purest sense of knowing, right? So that's what the jiva can do, but because of our actions and activities, we are unable to see through this sort of this cloud or this stain. And this sort of multiplism, and I'll talk a little bit about about this more once we get to the number 6 there, because number 6 talks about reality, and I can at least give you the example of how this form of multiplism comes about. But the central point is that as long as we are blinded, so to speak, or are covered, if we're clouded by this particular karmic context that we find ourselves in, we will only be able to see things in part, and obviously knowledge then becomes extremely limited. Extremely limited. All right, so let's move on to number three. So what is the cause of said problem? So humans have the spiritual soul, this jiva. The problem is that we're weighed down by all actions, regardless of the nature of our intentions, and that's what that says right there. Because of that ajiva, right, the subtle matter. So all activity. So again, this is a significant difference between what Hindus believe and what Jains believe. So what Hindus would suggest is that given that we are in line with our dharma, right, that we are following our duty and obligations, these good intended acts are not going to create this karmic stain, right? They're not going to lead us into more of the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, right? We can attain moksha even if we act with good intentions. Liberation is not the same with regard to Jain belief. So regardless of our intentions, regardless of our dharma, so to speak, right, all of our actions are going to create that subtle matter, regardless if they're good, bad, and different, right? So, and because of that, it becomes very, very hard, right? So in some ways, there's a recognition that this world, just like in Hinduism, is somewhat an illusion, and that we ought to break away from essentially living a worldly life, right? Living in a world where we have to act in ways that will create this sort of karmic stain that we have. So we might say, for Jainism, the cause of this karmic bondage is not just craving, although the more attached one is to the material world and its pleasures, one could say that the more karma will be accumulated. So Jains believe that all actions, no matter how well intentioned, are going to produce karma and burden the jiva. So therefore, only a commitment to inactivity or to activity that focuses on liberating the jiva will be effective at stopping the further accumulation of the said karmic matter. All right, so all activity places us in the sort of difficulty of being weighed down, right, regardless of our dharma, good intentions, and the like. All right, what is the end or goal? All right, so we got the cause of the problem. We know what the problem is. We know what our status is as human beings. So what is the goal, or what is the ultimate end for us, right? What is it that leads us to say transform ourselves? So the ultimate goal in Jainism is for the soul to be liberated, much like Hinduism, from its bondage to karma, so that one's true nature can be recognized or realized, right? So although Hindus call that the Atman, right? The Atman becomes absorbed within the divine, as opposed to, in this case, Jains do not believe that our souls are absorbed. Our souls are always separate, and that's what you say. Liberated souls, that's what you see, I should say. Liberated souls, the term is Kevalin, Kevalin. And so these liberated souls, when we actually become a jina, a conqueror of self, so you see there's a dichotomy here of two things, right? So becoming a jina is ultimately the aspect of liberation, right? So the conqueror, there have been 24 of these, as I said before. Mahavir would be one of those. He would be essentially the founder of what we call Jainism today. And there's at least one female Tirthankara as well. Here's the Tirthankara term. That just means bridging or crossing over. Right, so you get the term there that allows one to, say, be a conqueror of self. So they've determined how the self relates to its spiritual soul, right? The spiritual soul, or recognition of that jiva, as opposed to the material aspects of who we are. All right, so liberated souls, they go to a place called Loka, Loka, as opposed to, again, being absorbed by the divine. So in this case, Jain cosmology states that liberated souls would rise to the top of the universe, and again, that place is called Loka, Loka, and that is where they will dwell eternally in full consciousness, knowledge, and bliss. Sounds very pleasant. Much more pleasant than the the debate last night. That was awful. But I digress. So let's talk more about this. The Kevalin. The Kevalin would be the all-knowing one, right? The liberated soul is an all-knowing one. Through liberation, one soul joins all these other Tirthankaras, so Mahavira, Rishabha, and others, who have escaped the same bondage of karma to become jinas, right? To become a conqueror of self. So in effect, they attain a higher state than the gods in some way, because those gods would remain bound by a different form of karma. That's why I said it's not quite the same. Gods would have their own view of reality, other than being in a material body like we are, but they would have their own sort of set of circumstances because that's the nature of existence for Jains. So some of that mythology is somewhat difficult to filter through, but nevertheless, this is what they believe. They believe that the gods would remain bound by some invisible form of karma that we would be obviously unaware of. However, unlike Hinduism, or unlike say Hindu identification with, say, the Tat Ekam, the one, or Brahman, the creator, right? The one God of the Trimurti. There is no state of unity that is realized upon liberation. In other words, individual souls, according to Jains, remain separate. So again, that would be a distinction between Hinduism and Jainism. There is no ultimate communion with a personal God, as there is in some of the bhakti traditions of Hinduism. And yet, unlike Hinayana or Theravada Buddhism, which we'll talk about in the next worldview, souls do exist. So we have that to contend with. In addition to liberation, Jains seek well-being, so that's the second part here. So again, primary is becoming a jina. Second, it'd be well-being, or harmony would probably be a good way to characterize that. So a state of harmony with and satisfaction in the world, you could define it that way. A state in which one's, social, moral, and spiritual responsibilities are all properly balanced. All right, and keep in mind, if one seeks this path, they will not become a jina, right? So most lay Jains are going to take this type of path, oriented towards well-being and harmony, as opposed to seeking explicit liberation. So well-being is often the goal for the laity or lay Jains, and there are times even when monks and nuns may also focus on this state of being, but again, liberation is the core. But at times, this idea of well-being can concede, or I should say, the goal of becoming a jina concede to the nature of one's well-being or harmony, if that's the route that one chooses. All right, what are the means? What are the means to achieve said goal, becoming a jina and that well-being? Okay, so what we'll find is in almost all religions, you're going to have some element of what we would call asceticism or self-denial. This is a fundamental tenet of Jainism, asceticism and ahimsa. So although, again, we can find say we can find very conservative elements within Islam, Judaism, right? Hasidim and Judaism. In Christianity, it might be those who identify as Carthusian monks or something to that degree, where they essentially try to escape the world. Right? They deny everything worldly, and that was what Mahavira did essentially. Mahavira, during his transformation, decided he was not going to wear any clothes, cut off all his hair, or at least chopped it up, so he would walk around essentially naked and bare. Right? That's probably the most extreme form of asceticism that you can find, although very rare, especially in the 21st century. You could still find asceticism within probably any faith, right? You just got to look for the more conservative elements, and that will usually lead you to what that picture would look like. Okay, so unlike Hinduism, Jainism is a philosophy or religion of self-reliance. Right, so notice how the Hindu tenets don't require that we identify with gods, but certainly through yoga practices and through other means of whatever direction we might take to say to yoke the Atman, right, or to identify with the Atman. Gods can play a role in that. So what you're going to find in both Jainism and Buddhism is that gods play very, very little role. So in many cases, Jainism and Buddhism, at least some forms of Buddhism, have been identified as atheistic in some way. Not that they deny that gods exist. They just deny that gods have a role to play in seeking this goal and the means to seek that particular goal, right? So because it's a form of self-reliance, they also believe that in the quest to become Jains, that quest is their own. Gods cannot help them because gods are working on their own liberation, whatever that might look like. Priests cannot invoke any special powers. The Vedas, the Jain scriptures, the 84 agamas, and all scriptures are limited by the point of view of their writers. Right? That's a very novel idea, since in the West we identify with, the Old New Testament, the Quran, right, and all three of the major Western faiths suggest that those texts are either the explicit word of God, like in the Quran, or at least they are inspired words of God. But Jains recognize that regardless of the scriptures themselves, they have no ultimate authority. Right? They're limited points of view, and that goes back to that idea of the anekantavada, right? The multiplistic view of knowledge that we all have, that we are confined to because of our own sort of subjectivity and our own perspectives of the world. The key word in the Jain teaching about the path to liberation from samsara is that word right there, asceticism, right? So self-denial, which makes sense because we said over there, actions, right? All forms of actions create a subtle matter. And regardless of our intentions, that's what happens. So, might say only through a lifestyle of active self-denial, right? Active self-denial, active asceticism, can one hope to work off existing karma and avoid accumulating more karma. And only through ridding the soul of karma can liberation be attained. So asceticism can be considered a form of maybe vigorous spiritual exercise. And that particular asceticism is going to burn off this karmic stain that we gather throughout our life, especially when we're acting in the world. And asceticism obviously controls the appetite, right? It controls our connection to tangible desires, pleasures, right, attachments, and the like. And maybe a good analogy is just like how physical exercise can reduce calories and can curb our desire for food and drink and those kind of things, the same could be said of asceticism, right? It's going to reduce that karmic stain in some way. For Jains, the ideal way of living is to follow the example of those Tirthankaras, those conquerors, those jinas. So Mahavira would be the closest Tirthankara to us in terms of time, space-time. So we'll follow Mahavira's example, attempt to avoid all attachments. And although the path to liberation is open to all, regardless of caste, gender, or membership in any religious organization, in practice, only monks and nuns can maintain the extreme discipline required, right? So that goes back to the dichotomy there, right? The end or goal. So if we're not going to be monks or nuns, then it's going to be nearly impossible for us to become a jina. We certainly don't have to join a monastery to do that. I think one can do this, again, on their own, because this is about self-reliance. But I don't think one can go back and forth between trying to be an ascetic and living in the world at the same time. Those seem to be mutually exclusive to some degree. I don't think you can live in the world and become a jina at the same time. That doesn't seem to fit with the program. Let's see. Yep, so it doesn't matter what our caste, gender is, or any of that. I got the 5 great vows here, yeah. So the 5 great vows are, we're going to, number 1, ahimsa. That is the practice of non-violence, right? So we want to reduce, so Jains, like Buddhists, want to reduce suffering in the world, right? Suffering is a significant tenet in Buddhism, but it has its elements or its roots, at least in the principle of ahimsa, of non-harm, as one of the means. So that's one of the 5 great vows. So these would be the vows that all monks and nuns adhere to, and there would obviously be a sort of modified version for the laity, right, the lay Jains, but they would still agree to the great vows. They might just have a modified version of it. Okay, so we're going to renounce all killing of living things, right? The practice of ahimsa, do no harm, or the principle of non-harm. We're going to renounce all vices associated with speaking falsely, so lying, speech that arises out of anger or greed, so having the appropriate speech is important, right? Not to be a fearmonger or those kind of things. So obviously that's antithetical to what goes on in American culture. We'll also not steal, right? Not take things that are not given to us. So we'll renounce the taking of anything not given. We're going to renounce all sexual pleasures, right? So chastity obviously would be one of those significant forms of or a significant vow in the guise of being a monk or a nun. So obviously, a lay Buddhist, a lay Jain would not obviously adhere directly to, say, being chaste with regard to all sexual pleasures. And then lastly, you have to renounce all attachments. So regardless of their size, small, great, living or lifeless, all attachments, right? So family and those kind of things. So what is the mantra here? Let me get the mantra. The mantra is, I bow to the victors, those who have attained perfection, those who have attained liberation, to the religious leaders, to the religious teachers, and all the monks. And that is the mantra. I bow to the victors, those who have attained perfection, those who have attained liberation, to religious leaders, teachers, and all the monks. That is the mantra of the Jain. So you have the 5 great vows, and I'll post some notes on again some of the history and some of the other elements. That way you can get a better grasp of some of those means to those ends. Okay, so what about reality? Reality. All right, so here we have how Jains see reality in terms of a dualistic view, right? Dualism of matter and spirit. So you have the ajiva and jiva there that we talked about earlier. So reality is divided into the 2 categories: And each of these categories, let's put it this way, there are an infinite number of individual particles and substances that exist. So in the spiritual realm, there are infinite number of what they would call discrete souls that are present. These would be souls that were not created by a personal God, nor would they emanate from some world spirit. They have what they would call an eternally existing nature, right? So again, those that would exist in this fashion would have pure knowledge and goodness, right? So Jains do classify souls in terms of the number of senses they possess, right? So there's sort of a hierarchy of being that we don't necessarily have to get into. Again, matter is by nature evil, and when attached to souls, it obscures their purity and goodness. So matter and physical instantiation, right? Corporeal nature is the enemy here, is the evil that ties us or binds us to the world. Yeah, I think that's it for the reality aspect. And then, okay, here's the element that we were talking about earlier, this multiplism or this view of knowledge called anekantavada. Okay, so this stems from, what was it? This is the story, or at least an anecdotal story that's often been used, but it has its etymology in Jain thought. And it specifically has to do with the three blind men and an elephant. Right? So there are three blind men, and this is, again, just to demonstrate the nature of our sort of perspective view, right? We are bound to our own sort of subjectivity and what we view through that subjectivity. So the three blind men and the elephant, the three blind men all touch the elephant in different places. One touches the tail, thinks it's a rope. Another touches the side or touches the side of the elephant and thinks it's a stone wall. And then another blind man touches one of the elephant's ears and thinks it's a fan. Right, so this metaphor or this story is supposed to recognize, or at least represent or illustrate for us, that we are being blinded by our particular karmic context. Right, we can't escape the nature of our perception and our subjectivity, and because of that, we are limited in our knowledge and our scope. So, like these three blind men, that all give different perspectives. No one of them is a comprehensive view of really what's going on, right? So because of our souls being pure and all-knowing, once we exist in this world and we act in certain ways, act in any way really, right? Except trying to be an ascetic, right? Because we can actively engage in being an ascetic, which means we limit our actions, right, by self-denial. So the fact that we are perspective bound or situated in a certain way, that tells us that no view is comprehensible. All right, and then lastly, spiritual atheism. So this will be probably true of both Jains and Buddhists. And you have that term there, transtheistic. So we'll talk about that as well. So there is no creator God, or at least not in the sense that we needed a God to start things off. So Jainism is a religion that is at the same time atheistic yet spiritual, right? So how are those two things tied together? Jainism isn't atheistic in the sense of denying the existence of gods, like we said before, but in their cosmology, gods do exist, but again, they play no role in ultimate transformation. Right? So in pursuing the goal of becoming a Jina for all of us, right, we are relying on ourselves. It's essentially fruitless to pray to the gods or to put their trust in them because, again, Jains believe that gods gods are in some way, that makes more sense. Gods are in some way seeking liberation as well. It just wouldn't be the same type of liberation that we are seeking. The gods would exist as simple as other types of jivas, according to them, and they'd have their own sort of form of matter, and somehow that matter renders them, I guess, invisible. That would be the Jain claim. However, in the pursuit of well-being in this life, Jains do approach members of the Jain family for assistance, right? So there might be times where the second goal of well-being or harmony, there might be times where Jains reach out to those previous jinas or male and female deities that might be aspects of the divine, right? So Bhagavan and Devi, right, the goddess, or any of the sort of wandering mendicants, right? So Hindu mendicants or Jain mendicants who have sort of progressed further along in the path of enlightenment. All right, the other aspect, this transtheistic. So also what you'll find in Jainism, especially in the etymology of it, is the question of God's existence, right? Especially given certain characteristics or traits. So this is the origination of this sort of question about God in relation to God's, say, status, power, perfection, and those kind of things. So, for example, let's take the idea of perfection, right? So if we identify God as perfect, and especially with regard to creator, right? So we're talking about God as a creator world. So these are the same problems that arise in Western faiths, especially since all three of the faiths have a creator God that is in exactly the same God, despite the fact that they all call this God different names and recognize the same etymology of this God, of these gods, Yahweh, God, and Allah, right? So they're all the same. But so if we take this idea of God's perfection, so if God is perfect, then why create an imperfect world? Good question. And clearly it would be imperfect if we agree that suffering is part of that imperfection, right? So if we agree that there were no suffering, or that suffering is a component of imperfection, then we'd probably stand behind the question, or at least stand behind the idea of perfection in relation to a perfect world, an imperfect world. What about the nature of God and love? If God made the universe, so again, all of these responses to this idea of a creator God come into play because of the nature of suffering, right? The suffering that we endure and the suffering that all things endure. Okay, so in terms of love, if God made the universe because of love or out of love, then why would it be full of those suffering beings again? And if the universe is created, did God also need to be created, right? So that's the idea of the infinite regress, right? So even if we posit God's existence as the starting point for all things, reality, right? Even if you said, oh, everything happened because of the Big Bang, well, that doesn't answer the question of where the Big Bang came from, right? How did that arise? So how does anything come to be? And once you suggest here is the solution to it, the question then becomes, well, where did that thing come from? And usually the answer is, for a God, it's eternal, right? That would be really the only answer that's going to work, because any other answer is not going to be sufficient. You're just going to play the infinite regress game. Okay, so a perfect God, imperfect world, a loving God, but a world full of beings that suffer. If the universe is created, does that also mean God had to be created, or is just God exist all the time? And how do we know? All right, so essentially Jains are going to deny the process of creation. The universe is eternal. That's going to be one way to always respond to the idea of, or the concept of, a creator God. You don't have to have a creation of the universe if the universe has always been. Of course, how does one justify that is another question. All right, so think of, again, Jain's view of reality as a process of eternal change and creation, especially with regard to moral integrity. So there's going to be cycles of rise and fall of moral integrity and moral decay. That's how they're going to see the world through that lens. All right, so I'll stop there. I will post this video, And I will also post some more notes that give you a little more background on Jainism, as well as sort of spill out the vows and the different sects, 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 not SEX, SECTS, right? So there's different sects or branches, probably a better word since I can't say sex without it sounding like sex. So 4 branches: the Digambaras, the Shvetambaras, the Thanakavasis, and the Terapanthis. So I'll type those notes up for you and I'll post that as well. All right, thanks.